The courtroom air was heavy, thick with whispers and restless anticipation. Rows of strangers leaned forward in their seats, drawn not just by the trial itself, but by the spectacle of it. To them, this wasn't simply another day of justice being served. It was theater, one where a teenager stood accused of a crime far bigger than his years, and the judge presiding over it seemed already convinced of his guilt. Behind the long, polished bench sat Judge Wallace Greer, a man whose reputation was built on impatience and sarcasm. He drummed his fingers lazily against the desk, lips curling into a smirk that spoke volumes before he even opened his mouth. "So," he said, peering over the rim of his glasses, "we have a 19-year-old grand philosopher of the law standing before us. Tell me, son, is this a courtroom or your school's debate club?" The chuckles that followed weren't kind. Even the bailiff cracked a grin, and the stenographer shook her head as if she'd seen this routine too many times before. The prosecutor, Malcolm Carr, smirked broadly, confident this would be one of the easiest convictions of his career. But at the defense table, the young man everyone mocked stood motionless. His hands were buried in his hoodie pocket, his chin lifted just enough to reveal he wasn't afraid. His name was Jordan Hale, and though the judge saw a reckless boy and the prosecutor saw a pawn to crush, neither of them had any idea what they were really up against. Jordan wasn't just another teen in trouble. He had grown up with trials in his bloodstream. His mother, a paralegal for 2 decades, brought home stories of prosecutors cutting corners, judges playing favorites, and defense attorneys phoning it in. While other kids memorized game scores or lyrics, Jordan memorized case law. While his friends raced controllers across video game screens, he argued mock trials alone in his bedroom. By the time he was 14, he could break down a legal strategy better than many graduate students. Still, none of that mattered to Judge Greer. To him, Jordan was just another name in a thick case file. A 19-year-old accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious. The evidence looked airtight. But Jordan's faint, nearly invisible smirk told a different story. The prosecutor rose with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed his performance 100 times. Carr's suit was sharp, his tie perfect, his stride echoing across the floor as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the state will prove beyond any doubt that the defendant was caught red-handed inside a stolen luxury sedan. His fingerprints were on the steering wheel. He attempted to flee from officers. The evidence speaks for itself." The words landed like hammers. Spectators shifted, some nodding along as if the trial were already over. Judge Greer leaned forward, chin resting on his hand. To him, this was routine. The state would win. The boy would lose. And by 2 o'clock, he'd be on the golf course bragging about another efficient conviction. But Jordan wasn't shifting in his seat. He wasn't sweating or fidgeting. Instead, he let the silence stretch, calculating every move like a chess master setting his opening trap. When the judge turned toward the defense, Jordan's public defender, a timid woman named Laura Benton, rose unsteadily. She had barely spoken 3 words since entering the courtroom. Clearing her throat, she began, "Your Honor, my client." But she didn't finish. A hand on her arm stopped her. Jordan's hand. His quiet nod was all it took. She hesitated, then slowly sat back down. The boy everyone thought powerless finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and deliberate. "Your Honor, I'll be representing myself." The words fell like glass shattering across the courtroom. Gasps. Whispers. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Even Carr, the polished prosecutor, faltered for just a second before laughing outright. "This should be entertaining," he muttered under his breath. But Jordan wasn't joking. He stepped forward, hands still in his pockets, his stance casual yet unshakable. He let the pause linger, just long enough for the silence to turn uncomfortable, before finally adding, "And I'll begin by challenging the very foundation of the prosecution's case." The crowd leaned in. Even Judge Greer, amused though he was, raised an eyebrow. Jordan turned toward the prosecutor. "Mr. Carr, you claim Officer Reynolds personally witnessed me behind the wheel before my arrest. That's written in his report, yes?" Carr gave a tight smile, already sounding bored. "That's correct. And that testimony is on the record?" Jordan pressed. "Of course." Jordan nodded once. Then he pivoted to the judge. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. The judge blinked. On what grounds? Jordan finally pulled his hands free, gesturing toward the prosecution's desk. Because Officer Reynolds never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. The murmurs in the gallery exploded into full-on whispers. Carr's smirk wavered. What are you talking about? Jordan didn't flinch. I request the officer's GPS logs from that night. If his report is true, the data will match. But I have a feeling it won't. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Judge Greer studied Carr, who hesitated just long enough for the jury to notice. The gallery noticed. Everyone noticed. Finally, the judge sighed. Prosecution, do you object to verifying those logs? Carr's jaw tightened. No objections, Your Honor. The balance of the room had shifted. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing at Jordan. They were listening. But Jordan wasn't finished. He stepped closer to the jury box, his voice low, but cutting clear. The state says my fingerprints prove I stole that car. But let's think about this logically. If you try on a jacket in a store and someone steals it hours later, does that make you a thief? Jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered. Judge Greer leaned back, expression shifting. Jordan pressed forward. I leaned against that car when it was parked outside a convenience store earlier that night. I touched the door handle, maybe even the steering wheel when I peeked inside. But touching something doesn't make you guilty of theft. If it did, half the world would be in prison. The room went still. Even Carr's polished confidence seemed to falter. He shuffled his papers, searching for his next attack. And then Jordan delivered his sharpest cut yet. Your Honor, was a forensic specialist subpoenaed to testify about those fingerprints? Greer turned toward Carr, caught off guard. The prosecutor hesitated before admitting. No. Jordan let the silence sink in. So the state wants to convict me on evidence they won't even defend in person. No chain of custody. No cross-examination. Just blind trust. That isn't justice. That's convenience. Judge Greer rubbed his temple, suddenly realizing this case might not be the open-and-shut routine he expected. But the real bombshell was still coming. Jordan reached into his folder and held up a transcript. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence the original statement of the car's owner, one the prosecution conveniently left out of their filings. He began to read. I left my car running at the gas station. Some kid jumped in and drove off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. The kid I saw was white. The gasp that followed shook the room. Papers rustled. A reporter's pen froze mid-scratch. Judge Greer's smirk disappeared. Jordan lowered the page. His eyes locked on the jury. So tell me, ladies and gentlemen, how do you convict someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief? The silence was deafening. The trial that began as a joke was no longer funny. And this was only the beginning. For a moment, the courtroom seemed frozen in time. Reporters stopped writing. Jurors sat stiff in their seats. Even Judge Greer leaned back, suddenly aware that this trial wasn't going to be the casual victory he had imagined. Prosecutor Carr cleared his throat, his polished composure starting to slip. Your Honor, he said quickly, this is a distraction. The defendant was caught in possession of the stolen vehicle. That fact remains unchanged. Jordan tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Possession? His voice carried just enough weight to make the gallery lean forward. I wasn't in that car when they arrested me. I was blocks away, walking home from the convenience store with snacks in my hand. The car was already abandoned. But the officers found a black teenager nearby and decided that was close enough. The words dropped like stones into silence. Some jurors shifted in their seats, uneasy. A woman in the gallery shook her head slowly, muttering under her breath. Carr stepped forward, desperate to regain control. The defendant is twisting the facts. His fingerprints, Jordan cut him off smoothly, were never verified by a specialist in this courtroom. You're asking the jury to take your word for it, without evidence they can test for themselves. That isn't proof. That's storytelling. The crowd stirred. Carr's jaw tightened. He was losing ground, and he knew it. Jordan didn't press further right away. Instead, he turned to the jury, his voice softer now, more intimate. Ask yourself, if they can ignore the car owner's statement, if they can file a false report about where an officer was that night, if they can skip bringing in a forensic expert, what else are they leaving out? A hush fell over the room. Judge Greer shifted uncomfortably in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The trial was no longer routine. It was unraveling, thread by thread, in front of him. Jordan straightened his shoulders, eyes fixed on the bench. Your Honor, the prosecution has not met its burden of proof. Not even close. The evidence doesn't connect me to the theft. It only connects me to a moment of teenage curiosity. That's not a crime. That's being human. The gallery erupted in murmurs, louder this time, no longer mocking. Greer slammed his gavel once. Order! But his voice lacked the certainty it carried earlier. He glanced at Carr, who shuffled through his files, searching desperately for a weapon sharp enough to cut to the doubt now hanging in the air. Finally, Carr found something. Your Honor, he said quickly, we still have eyewitness testimony. Officer Reynolds identified the defendant at the scene. Jordan's lips curled into the faintest smirk. Then let's get the GPS records and see if he was even at the scene. Because if he wasn't, we're not talking about eyewitness testimony. We're talking about perjury. Gasps swept through the gallery. The word hung in the air like a dagger. Perjury. Carr froze, his face flushed. He hadn't expected the boy to go this far, to push this hard. Jordan leaned in slightly, his voice low, steady, every syllable deliberate. I may be 19. I may not have a law degree. But I know enough to recognize when the system tries to make an example out of someone who looks like me. And I won't let that happen today. The silence that followed was heavier than before, stretching long enough for everyone to feel the shift in power. The boy who had been mocked minutes earlier was now steering the entire courtroom. Judge Greer adjusted his glasses, his tone more cautious now. Prosecution. Do you have anything further to present at this stage? Carr's jaw clenched. No, Your Honor. The words were small, but the damage was enormous. The momentum of the case had turned completely. Jordan stepped back, folded his arms casually, as if to say, checkmate, for now. But what none of them knew, not even Jordan, was that the trial wasn't over. A new twist was waiting in the wings, one that could shift everything once more. Because while the jury was beginning to doubt, while the gallery was leaning toward sympathy, and while even the judge was questioning the case, someone unexpected was about to walk into that courtroom. And when they did, Jordan's battle would take a turn no one could have predicted. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Heads turned. Every shuffle and whisper died down as a tall figure stepped inside. The man wore a police uniform, his badge catching the glow of the overhead lights. His jaw was set, his stride deliberate. Officer Reynolds. The very witness whose testimony Jordan had just dismantled walked in as though summoned by fate. He moved confidently to the front of the courtroom, nodding politely to Judge Greer before taking a seat near the prosecution. The gallery stirred again. Reporters scribbled frantically, sensing the electricity in the air. Carr's eyes lit up. This was his chance to salvage the case. He rose quickly, smoothing his tie, his confidence returning like a spark reigniting a flame. Your Honor, Carr announced, the state calls Officer Samuel Reynolds to the stand. Judge Greer adjusted his glasses, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face. Very well. Bailiff, swear him in. As Reynolds raised his hand to take the oath, Jordan studied him closely. His breathing was steady, but inside his mind was racing. This was the officer who claimed to have seen him behind the wheel, the officer whose report could bury him, unless the truth came out. Reynolds took his seat, posture upright, voice crisp. Carr wasted no time. Officer Reynolds, please describe the events of the night in question. Reynolds spoke smoothly, like a man who had told this story many times before. I was patrolling near 8th and Marlowe when I observed a black sedan speeding through an intersection. I pursued, saw the driver exit after abandoning the vehicle, and identified the defendant, Jordan Hale, as the individual behind the wheel. His testimony flowed easily, practiced. To practice, Jordan leaned forward slightly, catching the subtle cues, how Reynolds avoided eye contact when mentioning key details, how his story was almost too clean. Carr turned to the jury, gesturing confidently. There you have it. Direct eyewitness testimony confirming the defendant was the driver of the stolen car. For a moment, it looked like the tide had shifted back. Jurors glanced at one another, whispers rippling through the gallery. Carr's smirk returned. But then Jordan stood. His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. Your Honor, may I cross-examine a witness? Judge Greer hesitated. The boy had already bent the rules of the court, but the trial had taken on a life of its own. Finally, he nodded. Proceed. Jordan walked slowly toward the stand, his footsteps echoing on the courtroom floor. He stopped just short of the rail, his eyes fixed on Reynolds. Officer Reynolds, he began softly, you say you pursued the stolen car from 8th and Marlowe? Yes, Reynolds answered confidently. And you personally saw me exit the vehicle? That's correct. Jordan tilted his head, his voice still quiet but sharper now. Tell me, what color was the shirt I was wearing that night? Reynolds blinked. His mouth opened, then closed again. I believe it was gray. Jordan let the silence stretch, then asked, Gray? Are you certain? Yes, Reynolds said firmly, regaining composure. Jordan stepped back slightly, turning toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, I was wearing a bright red hoodie that night. And here's the receipt from the store where I bought it, less than an hour before my arrest. He held up the slip of paper for all to see. A ripple of shock swept through the room. Reynolds stiffened. Perhaps my memory. Jordan cut him off, his tone sharper now. Perhaps your memory? Officer, you claim you chased me through the streets, identified me as the driver of a stolen car, and yet you can't recall the color of my clothing? The jurors shifted again. Some frowned. Others whispered to each other. The cracks were widening. Jordan pressed further. And if your memory is so clear, why do GPS records suggest you weren't even near 8th and Marlowe when the chase began? Reynolds' face paled. He glanced toward Carr, who fumbled with his notes. Judge Greer leaned forward, his expression tightening. Answer the question, officer. Reynolds swallowed hard. I was nearby. Maybe the system logged it incorrectly. The excuse sounded hollow, even him. The courtroom murmurs swelled. Jordan's eyes locked on him, unrelenting. So either your memory is unreliable or your report is false. Which is it, officer? The silence that followed was suffocating. Reynolds shifted in his seat, sweat beading on his forehead. For the first time, the jury wasn't looking at Jordan like a criminal. They were looking at Reynolds like a liar. Carr jumped his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is badgering the witness. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Judge Greer slammed his gavel. Order. But his voice cracked just slightly, betraying the truth. This trial was spiraling out of control, and Jordan knew it. He stepped back from the stand, calm, collected, his final words aimed straight at the jury. If the officer who swore to uphold justice can't keep his story straight, then how much faith can you have in the rest of this case? The room erupted again. The gallery buzzed with disbelief. The prosecutor's face burned red. But the trial wasn't over. Not yet, because just when Jordan thought he had the upper hand, a new revelation was about to surface. One that could either set him free or shatter his defense completely. The courtroom had shifted from laughter to unease. What began as a performance mocking a teenager had turned into something far more dangerous. For the prosecution, for Officer Reynolds, and even for Judge Greer himself. Reynolds sat stiff in the witness box, sweat glistening on his brow. The jurors' eyes pierced him, no longer convinced by his crisp uniform or confident tone. Jordan had cracked his armor, and everyone could see it. But the prosecutor wasn't finished. Carr leaned forward, gripping the edge of his desk as though holding on for survival. Your Honor, he said quickly, I'd like to redirect. The defendant is distracting this court with technicalities. The fact remains that his fingerprints were on the stolen car. No amount of wordplay changes that. Jordan turned slowly, his face calm, but his voice steady and deliberate. Then let's talk about fingerprints, Mr. Carr. Let's talk about how evidence can be manipulated, how reports can be padded, how stories can be shaped to fit whatever conclusion the state wants. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang over the jury. Then, with surgical precision, he asked, "Did the prosecution call the forensic specialist who handled the fingerprints?" Carr hesitated. Everyone noticed. "No," Judge Greer answered for him, his tone edged with frustration. Jordan's lips curved into the faintest smile. "So we're convicting people based on paperwork and assumptions, without ever questioning the process that created them? Tell me, Your Honor, is that justice?" The gallery erupted in murmurs. Some nodded. Others whispered fiercely. Even the jurors were restless now, their once certain expressions replaced with doubt. But Carr wasn't ready to concede. His voice rose, tinged with desperation. "Your Honor, the defendant is trying to confuse his jury. This is simple. He was caught. His prints were there, and the case is airtight." Jordan stepped closer, his presence commanding, his voice lowering like a blade being unsheathed. "Then why?" he asked, pulling another document from his folder. "Did the car's owner say otherwise?" The courtroom froze. Jordan unfolded the transcript and read aloud, his voice echoing in the silent room. "I left my car running outside the gas station. Some kid jumped in and drove off. But it wasn't the guy they arrested. The one I saw was white. The gasp that followed shook the walls." Reporters' pens flew across their notepads. Jurors exchanged stunned looks. Judge Greer's face hardened. "Is this true, Counselor Carr? Why was this statement not in the filings?" Carr stumbled, his face pale. "Your Honor, perhaps it was an oversight." "An oversight?" Jordan's voice rose for the first time, filled with sharp indignation. "An eyewitness statement that contradicts your entire case? Left out by accident." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his face turning red. The gallery buzzed with outrage, some spectators muttering curses under their breath. Jordan seized a moment, turning to the jury. "You've been told this case was clear, that I was guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt. But now you see the truth. Reports that don't line up. Testimony that doesn't hold. Evidence no one bothered to defend. And a statement, conveniently buried, that points to someone else entirely." The jurors stared back at him, their faces caught between disbelief and outrage. For the first time, they weren't just listening. They were leaning in. Judge Greer raised his gavel, but his voice was softer now, almost resigned. "Order." Jordan stepped back, letting his words settle. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't grandstanding. He was calm, collected, and unshakable. And then, just when it seemed the case was slipping entirely out of the prosecution's hands, Carr played his last desperate card. "Your Honor," he said loudly, his voice echoing off the walls, "the state has one more piece of evidence. A recording, captured by a security camera the night of the theft. Footage that shows the suspect fleeing the stolen car." The gallery gasped again. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the jurors shifted, wide-eyed. Jordan's calm demeanor didn't falter, but inside, his mind sharpened. This was new. Footage? He hadn't seen it in the discovery files. Why had it been hidden until now? Judge Greer leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Play the footage." The lights dimmed slightly as a screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The grainy black and white video showed a car screeching to a halt near an alleyway. A figure bolted from the driver's seat, hoodie pulled over their head, sprinting into the darkness. Carr smirked. "There, that's the defendant. That's proof." Gasps filled the gallery once more. The jury leaned in closer. Jordan's eyes narrowed. His pulse quickened. He studied every flicker of the footage, every blurred frame. Something was off. Something Carr hadn't noticed, or maybe something he hoped no one else would. And as Jordan stepped closer to the screen, he felt it. The truth was right there, hiding in plain sight. If he could prove what he saw, everything would change. The grainy footage played again, the faint glow of the screen washing over the courtroom. A hooded figure bolted from the driver's side of the stolen sedan, sprinting across the frame before vanishing into the shadows. To most eyes, it was little more than a blur, a silhouette of guilt. Prosecutor Carr folded his arms, triumphant. "There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Visual proof. That's the defendant Jordan Hale, fleeing the stolen car." The gallery buzzed, reporters scribbling in a frenzy. Jurors leaned toward the screen, eyes narrowed, struggling to discern the figure's features. Judge Greer adjusted his glasses, his expression grim. But Jordan didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "Play it again." The bailiff rewound the tape. The figure appeared once more, darting across the frame. Jordan's eyes tracked every detail. The stride, the posture, the clothing. Something wasn't right. "Freeze it," he said suddenly. The bailiff paused the footage mid-motion. On the screen, the figure was caught mid-stride, the hoodie flaring as one leg stretched forward. Jordan pointed. "Look closely, ladies and gentlemen. That person is taller than me, at least by half a foot. And if you zoom in on the shoes..." The technician adjusted the playback, zooming on the blurred feet. White sneakers gleamed in the dark, the sole thick and distinctive. Jordan turned to the jury. "I was wearing red canvas shoes that night. Thin soles, worn from years of use. These are brand new. And if you doubt me..." He pulled off one of his battered sneakers and held it up. "Compare them for yourselves." Gasps swept through the gallery. Jurors leaned in, eyes wide. Even Judge Greer tilted forward, scrutinizing the screen. Carr stammered, his voice breaking. It's grainy footage. Impossible to be certain." Jordan cut him off, his voice rising for the first time. "Impossible to be certain? That's your proof?" "A blurry video of someone taller than me, wearing different shoes, running from a car I was never inside." The silence that followed was louder than any gavel. Jordan's voice softened, steady as steel. "The truth is simple. The real thief got away that night. The police found me nearby, assumed I was guilty because I fit a story they wanted to tell, and the prosecution ran with it, ignoring evidence, burying statements, and presenting lies as fact. That isn't justice. That's a shortcut." The jury sat frozen, the weight of his words pressing down on them. Some nodded, others clenched their jaws. Judge Greer leaned back, his smirk long gone. His voice was low, deliberate. "I've heard enough." The gavel slammed once, sharp as thunder. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted, half in shock, half in applause. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their cameras flashing like lightning. The gallery rose to its feet, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding in quiet triumph. Jordan didn't move right away. He let the moment settle, his chest rising and falling with quiet control. For the first time since the trial began, he smiled. Not the smirk of defiance, but the smile of someone who had carried the weight of truth and finally set it down. Judge Greer's eyes lingered on him. There was something new in his gaze now. Not mockery, not dismissal, but recognition, and maybe, just maybe, regret. "Mr. Hale," the judge said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "you should consider law school." Jordan didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply turned and walked toward the exit, his mother waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. She crossed her arms, her face a storm of fear and pride. "You scare me half to death," she whispered. Jordan chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take the risk, Ma." She shook her head, then pulled him into a fierce embrace. Stubborn as ever. The cameras outside flashed relentlessly, reporters shouting questions, but Jordan barely noticed. Across the street, Judge Greer stood watching, his posture no longer arrogant. The system he once thought unshakable had been challenged by a teenager, and for once it had blinked. Jordan knew this wasn't just about him. For every case dismissed, countless others slipped through the cracks, lives broken by bias, shortcuts, and assumptions. He had the knowledge to fight back. But what about those who didn't? That was his answer. His next step. This courtroom wouldn't be the last he entered. But the next time, he wouldn't stand as a defendant. He would stand as an attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. If this story made you think, share it. Comment your thoughts below. Because justice isn't just a word, it's a fight. And sometimes it takes the unlikeliest voices to remind the system of its own truth.